Okay, so let's get started. Thank you so much, Marshall and Chris, for being here. And I wanted to jump in with this just by having each of you talk a little bit about yourselves as a writer. What do you write? Who are you? Yeah, Marshall, we can start with you.
Okay. My name is Marshall Ryan Maresca. I am primarily a fantasy writer, primarily a novelist. I have currently 11 fantasy novels out there, and my 12th one is coming out in October. They're all set in the same setting, though it's 4 different series, though all 4 series sort of intertwined together to make it one mega series. And there's no way I can talk about it without sounding like a lunatic, so I'm going to try and just not talk about it. Anyway, the first couple books that you could pick up of mine would be The Thorn of Dentonhill, A Murder of Mages, The Holver Alley Crew, or Way of the Shield. I've been doing this. I was first published in 2015. I was doing the grind of, being like trying to be a working author seriously starting in, I want to say 2007, and finished the novel that was published in 2015 in 2008. So that should give you some idea of like what the timelines of these sorts of things can sometimes go. And that's me and who I am.
Thanks. Chris?
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Brown. I'm currently dialing into you from Port Aransas down on the Texas coast. So if you hear any seagulls or screaming children in the background, thanks to the explanation. So my apologies for any of that. I'm best known as a science fiction novelist, mainly as a dystopian novelist. I had my first novel, Tropic of Kansas, which is a story about a kind of a two people caught up in the middle of an uprising in a sort of alternative or near future United States, and that was followed up last year with Rule of Capture, which was a mashup of the dystopian novel and the legal thriller about a kind of a rundown criminal defense lawyer in Houston who figures out a way to make a living after essentially martial law is declared to deal with some particularly rowdy protests, and they're locking people up without due process. The follow-on to that is coming out in a little over a month, a book called Failed State, which is a little more utopian in its focus and a little more heavy on the green themes, which run through all of the books, which they all are variations on cli-fi, I suppose you might say. But I've been at it for a lot longer than that, kind of like Marshall. I was writing short fiction for many, many years, going back to the early aughts and even earlier. I started out, among other things, taking classes through the Writers League, where I learned a great deal, and hopefully can share some of my own experiences about how to go from having a busy day job, in my case as a lawyer, to breaking through and building a career as a novelist in the field I wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. And so I think this worked out pretty well because Marshall, you just said that you're mainly fantasy, and Chris, you're mainly science fiction. And so I'm wondering if each of you can just give us like a quick definition about how you sort of differentiate between the two, and also what drew you in particular to that genre.
It is such a messy thing to try and define the difference between the two. I've always felt like the difference is the difference between the plausible and the impossible, whereas science fiction at least touches on the plausible of what could happen, whereas fantasy makes possible the impossible. Yeah. That's to me the biggest distinction between the two. But there is such fertile yet messy ground between the two, where you can have something that's either or both or kind of neither, that still falls under the umbrella of science fiction and fantasy in some weird way or not, which is part of what I love about it, is that it can be such a messy genre that has so much under the big umbrella.
Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good definition, that the plausible versus the impossible. I mean, I think of it even more broadly in terms of all of the kinds of writing that qualifies as literature of the fantastic or imaginative literature. And to me, they're all, if they're done well, they're all to some extent sort of variations on realism, and that they're all kind of grounded in, you know, our own experience of the observed world and of what it feels like to live in the observed world. I think that science fiction is better equipped to really, although it's often about the future or set in an imagined future, it's generally really about the present and about the issues of contemporary life, using the tools of speculative fiction and of the fantastic to tell truths about life, about kind of contemporary life or what's emergent in contemporary life that kind of conventional modes of realism cannot. At least that's how I think about it. And you know, I think about writers like J.G. Ballard and Margaret Atwood as kind of leading exemplars of how to go about doing that. Whereas fantasy, I think, is often, it's focused on the past or on a reworking of the past or taking the material of the past or entering into just the world of kind of pure imagination, unencumbered by any sense of having to have a fidelity to kind of what the experience of real life is like.
And I think the cool thing too about what you guys have said is just that in these genres, you know, you're not constrained by our reality. Like, you have so much freedom to do what you want to do. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you start writing, you know, because it can be hard enough to write, like, to face that blank page when you're just talking about our own reality. But when you have so much more, like, what does your writing process look like? Chris, we can stay with you if you want.
Right on. Well, it starts with butt in chair, as some friends of mine like to say, or my friend, the great writer, best known for young adult fiction, Gwenda Bond. She says, "Stop dicking around." Pardon my French. And I think it's sort of easy. It's like a lot of things in life. It's like, I often feel like when I see my dog sort of circle around the bed, debating whether to lay down and get after it, or when they dance around the food, there's a little of that goes on. But I mean, that your question about how do you go about writing with all of these elements of the imaginative part that you're sort of layering on top. It is harder in some ways, but it's also a lot more liberating because you have a lot more freedom to just kind of go where the material wants you to go. If you start with character as kind of your core point, and you have an idea of who this initial person is from whose perspective you're telling the story, or perhaps in whose voice you're telling the story. And then if you have a kind of a basic situation in which you put them, I think you have a pretty good starting point, and you just got to try to, like, kind of set aside at least, you know, just enough time to sort of dive into that scenario and see where it can go with you, following your intuition and following all of the internalized things you've acquired over the years as a reader and from your own life. And if you can get kind of half an hour in a day of doing that and set some goals for yourself and some deadlines, I think you can make tremendous progress. As long as you learn the hardest rule for me to learn, which is to always finish what you started. And the kind of the bigger the project is, the more important that it is that you finish it, because starting out with that blank page is easy. It's when you're halfway into a book and you get totally stuck and you're like, oh my God, how did I get into this mess? I have written myself all the way into a corner. Everybody's going to see what an idiot I am. I'm going to totally fail in public. And that's when the magic happens, when you have to solve those kinds of problems from like instead of like, oh, I got to just start over. It's like, no, you need to solve that challenge you created for yourself of, like, how do you get down off the other side of that mountain? So, and Marshall, of course, never gets lost like that because he writes 400 outlines that are longer than most of our books.
I do write a lot of outlines, and I do a lot of world building work ahead of time. When you're talking about how, like, you know, if you can do anything, then what, you know, where do you start? And I think at least for me, a big part of that process is sitting down and doing the work, especially on the world building aspect of whatever you're going to do, because that is such a, like, if you can do anything, then you need to make choices about the parameters you're going to set, and that is a key aspect of that world building process. I didn't mention when I was giving my bio and credentials, I'm on a podcast that is called Worldbuilding for Masochists, because the whole principle being that we're doing all that sort of deep dive work in our world building that doesn't even necessarily show up on the page, but just the process of doing that work and knowing what those underlying levels are in your work can enrich in everything you're doing. Like, you can make any choice you want, but then you might want to stop and think about what are the ramifications of that choice? What are the underlying factors that make that choice work? How do I express that choice in ways that show it all positively rather than not showing it just by the absence of it?
Right. And we just got a question in the chat, and Heidi is asking, if you have your world and you have your plot, is there a technique for parsing them out? I keep wanting to dump info right up front.
Okay, so my main rule of thumb is you put out information to the level to which it is relevant to the story you're telling. Because you can, I mean, and I know this from personal experience, you can have like the whole like lineage of rulers and history and all the wars and all that, but there's no need to impose that upon your reader if that's not specifically relevant to the story that's being told. And the best time to parse out that information is when it becomes story relevant.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you know, there's a concept in painting, the idea of negative space. It's like about the power of the things of the sort of space on the canvas that's not painted or that's sort of not used for the active object in view. Or I don't know which classical composer it was who said that, you know, that the most important part of any musical composition is the space between the notes. And I think that's true, very true with writing fantastic fiction, that it's really important to have a clear vision in your own head as an author as to kind of how the world works. I think you want to be careful about over detailing it, because there's a lot of interactivity between the character of the world building element, and story or plot. And to me, they have to all kind of like flesh each other out as character in a way, or in the way that character does. But if you can keep as much as you can off the page, but yet know exactly what it is, and just let it manifest itself through the story, through the things that the characters would naturally talk about, it really will work best. There's a great tool for writing science fiction and fantasy literature, kind of a workshop tool called the Turkey City Lexicon, that was developed by Bruce Sterling and Louis Shiner out of the Austin-based Turkey City workshop. And that has all of these interesting critical terms, one of which is the "as you know, Bob," which is the kind of critical term for over-explaining your info dump. And it's like, imagine the two pilots on the starship in some 1950s science fiction story, and it's, "As you know, Bob, we developed the warp drive in New Year 7588, you know, when Dr. So-and-so," and these long expositions. And the notion is that those don't really work, right? But then there are really great authors who do all kinds of info dumps, and they do them really well. Kim Stanley Robinson comes to mind. Neil Stevenson comes to mind. And so if you do them well, they can be really awesome, but you need to treat them as sort of works in their own right, and let them have their own voice, as it were.
A great way to get around the "as you know, Bob" is by having one of your characters not be Bob and not know things. Because, I mean, one of one of the strengths along the lines of dumping exposition in the Harry Potter books is the fact that Harry Potter knows absolutely nothing about the world he found himself in. And so there can be all sorts of things that for everyone else around him, like, no, this is just normal, but he knows nothing about it. So that's a technique you can use. Now, that's not an excuse to just then dump, information on your glorious idiot who knows nothing about the world that they're in. But that is just one of the tools you can put into your box.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, in my first novel, Tropic of Kansas, the main protagonist is basically a homeless teenager who has a very limited experience with the world. He's been like living outside, most of the past few years, and he sort of, the story opens when he gets deported back into the United States that's been walled off from the Canadian side. All right, and he knows nothing of the world. And on the one hand, it achieves sort of a cool effect because you're sort of at sea the way he is, but I ended up having to like invent another character who knew the world just to sort of make it work. Whereas in Rule of Capture, I had the very easy situation, right to Marshall's point of the main character is a lawyer and he's got a client and he has to explain to the client the situation they're in a way that a non-lawyer client will understand. And that, you can definitely construct, there are always ways to find natural conversations that help explain what's going on in the world.
Thank you.
Chris's earlier point about negative space is also really strong along those lines. By using a singular detail that lets your reader fill out all those other details just by the implications that you make by the one single thing.
Yeah.
We're going to switch gears a little bit because we're already over halfway through our conversation. And I want to touch on the business of science fiction and fantasy. And so you both write short stories and novels. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk about your experiences with one or the other. Marshall, you could take or Chris, you could take short stories actually, and just talk about maybe journals that you might submit to and what that process looks like.
I mean, I started out writing short stories as a way to kind of break into the field. It's a lot easier to complete a short story that works than it is to complete a novel that you're happy with. And it's a great way to get out there and start to get attention. And it's a great way to, on a collegial basis, if you like workshop formats, to get it in front of other similarly situated peers. The where to submit to kind of depends on the kind of work you're doing, but I think you need to look at the sorts of magazines that you like reading as the best guide to where you ought to be submitting. With works that qualify as science fiction or speculative fiction, there's everything from the established commercial print mags like Asimov's and Analog and Fantasy and Science Fiction, and some similar magazines out of the UK. But there are also, all manner of online magazines like Strange Horizons and others that have developed over the past decade that are equally and maybe better in certain terms of, literary quality and paying at comparable professional rates. And there are all sorts of writers' guides out there online for you to look to. Don't set out to write short fiction to try to make money unless you're like our friend Howard Waldrop, who's kind of one of the greatest living writers of fantastic short stories, who actually makes what qualifies as a living for him just off the kind of pulp pay rates. But the pay rates on those magazines mostly haven't really gone up since since the 1930s, when they were originally set. And if you want to go beyond short stories a little further, you can go into the novella market, which is a really kind of a hot space now, which is sort of, things above 20,000 words, maybe in that range, shorter than a novel. There's a rich market for those now. There are perfect length for audiobooks, and publishers like Tor and my publisher, Harper Voyager, they're doing a lot more novellas, and that's an interesting thing to look at as well.
Thank you. Marshall?
Yeah, I have very little to say on short stories because I'm kind of terrible with short stories. I've written a grand total of 2 short stories, both of which were 4 anthologies that people were like, I want you to write a short story for this. So, like, especially in terms of like like looking for markets and all that, like I found it impossible for me personally to write a short story when I didn't already know where it's going. And that's partly just because of how I think story-wise. Novel-wise, yeah, that's always been more my comfort zone, and just because that's, it takes me a good 5,000 to 10,000 words just to clear my throat, let alone write the whole story out. And again, like the big thing with that, the big picture advice I'd give with that to anybody is focus on getting something finished, because I've talked with a lot of up and coming fledgling writers who like keep reworking those first chapters and never getting to the finish line with the draft. And there's a lot of wisdom to just getting something done, then cleaning it up to the point where it's where it works, and then start throwing it out into the world. And then if the world doesn't pick up on it, then do it again. There's nothing wrong with writing what's called a trunk novel, where you write the whole novel and you edit it and you send it out in the world, nobody wants it, and you put it in a trunk and you forget about it. And maybe if you become a big person later, then your grandchildren can sell that for some money later because it's buried there. But it's okay to, nobody can teaches anybody how to write a novel. It's something you have to learn how to do yourself. So more often than not, that first novel you write is going to be a mess, because that's how you learned how to write a novel. And it's okay to then be like, all right, I'm putting this aside. Now that I know the process of doing it, I'm going to take that knowledge and use it again to write something else. So I wrote 2 novels that are in a trunk before I wrote the novel that became the first one I actually sold. And don't feel bad about spending your time doing that and then putting it to the side, because it's not wasted time. It's time put into learning.
Yeah, writing is a muscle that you have to like work out all the time.
Yeah.
Cool. So just to close our conversation, can you give us some recommendations, books, authors, magazines, just specific to sci-fi and fantasy?
Books, authors, like
Your favorites.
I'm always loath, like in moments like this, because it's almost such a cliche when you ask people for like recommendations in fantasy. They will give you the litany of the dead people who you should be reading that aren't necessarily relevant. Rather, I'd say if you're writing science fiction or fantasy now and are looking to sell now, pay attention to what's happening now. Grab a ton of stuff that has come out in the past 3 to 5 years. Look at the stuff that's won awards in the last 3 to 5 years to get a stronger sense of what is happening right now. So like in fantasy, look at something like Alex Harrow's The 10,000 Doors of January, or what's another one that made a lot of big noise. This is more science fantasy than, so it combines the elements of both science fiction and fantasy. The Gideon the Ninth by I'm blanking the author.
Tamsin Muir.
Yeah, that's been a big one in terms of both of those got nominated for a bunch of awards in the past year or so. One that I will always throw at anybody who is asking for a fantasy recommendation is Fonda Lee's Green Bone Saga. The first one is Jade City. It is like nothing else you've read in terms of traditional fantasy. It is set in a secondary world that is based on more of a Pan-Asian culture. It is essentially Kung Fu movies meets The Godfather with magic. I love it. It is one of the best books you'll read that came out in the past few years. I will scream about it from high heaven all the time. What are some other ones? Chris, throw out some ones that
I think that it's always kind of a funny exercise to me, sort of suggesting to other people what they should read, because I feel like you got to kind of follow your own literary
That's
instincts.
very true.
And a lot of it is about like read outside the field. If you want to innovate in science fiction or fantasy, go read things that aren't science fiction and fantasy. Just read like great novels by people who are outside the genre
That's very true too.
And that's where you're gonna get the most. You're gonna, like, whatever it is that turns you on. I mean, like for me, I was hugely influenced by the novels of Joan Didion. You know, as like she was doing things like showing how to write a novel in the way I wanted to while I was working on Tropic of Kansas, and similarly Cormac McCarthy. I mean, but there are sort of greats of the genre that I really, you know, are kind of my lodestars of like, I wish I could kind of operate at that level. And what they're doing is, some of them come from a science fiction background, self-proclaimed science fiction background. Some of them come from a more literary background and might even disclaim that their works are science fiction. But they are people who have, their works are equally powered by the pistons of like the science fictional sense of wonder engine and that character-driven literary engine. And these are people like Margaret Atwood and J.G. Ballard and Octavia Butler, William Gibson. Those are people that I think are kind of, you know, among the first kind of icons that come to my mind. I had the great experience. I think it's very important to read, you know, diverse voices to get a better sense of all these different perspectives that are out there on how one might experience the world, especially if you're trying to imagine other worlds or other, you know, modes of being. And a couple of years ago, I had the good opportunity to be a judge in the Philip K. Dick Award competition, which is given out every year to the best paperback original science fiction. And I saw some amazing work in there, including pretty new writers like Brooke Bolander, who had a novella that won the Nebula last year called The Only Harmless Great Thing. Beautifully written, really stylistically innovative, elements of alternate history, and kind of near future stuff. Alien Virus Love Disaster by a more literary writer named Abby May Otis, spelled A-B-B-E, I think M-E-I, Otis, three word name. And these are short stories that like really work as science fiction, but read like the voice of kind of your classic like MFA, you know, MFA program stories. They're really good.
Another good one who is new and showing some of the dynamic things that are happening in the genre and also local, Nikki Drayden. You should get every single book Nikki Drayden has written and pour it into your brain. Your brain will be better for it.
There's one other I'm trying to remember. Vandana Singh is a Indian American woman writer who is a physicist, teaches physics at UMass Amherst. And she has this story collection called Ambiguity Machines and Other Stories that was put out by Small Beer Press. That's just like masterful in its range of like kind of like Borgesian, but like totally like cosmically science fictional at the same time. Published by the Small Press run by Kelly Link, who is another great you know, Pulitzer finalist just based on writing fantasy short stories. It's just like, how badass is that? So there's just a lot of great stuff out there, and if you go find one author, they'll lead you to the other, and you know.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Marshall and Chris. We're gonna get started with our breakout rooms, and so everyone can start turning their mics and cameras on, and I will get that set up.